First off, we want to look at the context behind the debate. What should you research before you begin writing your arguments and your speeches? The first question is, what is an opinion poll? And have you ever heard of any specific ones? It's good to have some kind of broad understanding of what an opinion poll is in the first place, and have a list of examples that you can refer back to when writing your speeches. The second question is getting more specific. What types of questions are on a political opinion poll? There are broadly a few answers to this, but it's worth researching so that you know even more than the ones I'm about to say. You are often asked for who you would vote for at the next election, which party would that be? And so that might be one of the major parties, the Labour Party or the Liberal National Party. It could be that you say that you would vote for an independent candidate. You might say that you would vote for someone from a minor party, say the Greens or One Nation or some other party there. They also often ask about a two-party preferred vote. That is to say that in any given seat and nationally, at most elections, there are only a couple of parties that are likely to win the seat, so it's relevant to ask who would you put higher up in your preference order, because in Australia we have preferential voting. Two-party preferred often then is asking, regardless of who you would vote for with your first preference, would you prefer to vote for the Labour Party or the Liberal Party in most seats? A third question that is asked is about preferred Prime Minister or preferred Premier if you are putting an opinion poll in a specific state. This is where you do not ask about the party, but merely the person leading that party. There are also some other questions that you might ask about specific policies rather than the party as a whole, and so it's worth researching what kind of questions have been put on opinion polls in the past. The third question is who organizes or pays for political opinion polling? Again, there are several answers to this question, so it's worth researching so that you can point to, firstly, what the different examples are, and secondly, how those different examples may help you come up with different points. For example, some political opinion polls are funded by political parties. They often conduct polls themselves so that they know where they should target the next election in terms of their where they should spend more money to try and win the seat and where they should prioritize their volunteering efforts as well. A second group that often funds for political opinion polls are news outlets. News outlets often want to fund their own opinion polls because then they sort of have first dibs at reporting them before anyone else because they've conducted the research themselves. There are also possibly other groups that conduct opinion polls, and so it's worth researching so that you have more answers to this question and arguments that can interact in different ways. And a final question that's worth asking is, are political opinion polls normally accurate? Obviously, whenever you conduct an opinion poll, it is a group of people in the broader population, so it's incredibly unlikely that you will get it exactly right. That means that there is usually what we call a margin of error. That is, usually we might say that an opinion poll falls within perhaps 2 or 3% of what is actually going to occur at the next election. But different opinion polls in different places might have different normal margins of errors. Maybe in one place you have very good opinion polls, and so usually they are within 2 points of being correct. Sometimes they might be really bad, and usually within 4 points of being correct. How accurate are they? Also look at the overall result. Do they normally correctly pick who will win elections? Do different types of opinion polls have more accurate preferences? Is, for example, something that refers to a party more likely to be accurate to what ends up being how people vote than how people would vote based on individuals? It's worth researching this because, again, it will probably be quite relevant to your arguments whether or not and what types of political opinion polls are and are not reliable. Next thing to do in setup is to start to define the topic. There are broadly, I think, a few key words in this particular topic. One is our classic word ban. Ban, remember, always means that you must completely prohibit. There can't really be exceptions in most ban debates. It will almost always make your arguments weaker as an affirmative team, because every time you look for an exception, you also create a reason why it's important not to ban it. So ban should usually just mean completely stop. But you also often need to think about, and we'll get to this in a bit with modeling, what are the consequences for breaking a ban? The second thing is publication. This is going to be very interesting when we begin to look at modeling this debate, but publication broadly is going to mean having reporting on the political opinion polls in things such as newspapers and on TV news shows and the like. But it's also worth coming up with your own definition in case you have an alternative way that is useful to define it. And finally, political opinion polls. You will have broadly got a very good understanding of this if you've done the research questions that I asked beforehand. So it's worth doing those questions so that you can define the topic. Next, we go on to modeling and counter-modeling. Often in debating, negative teams have the most choice in regards to how they approach a debate. But in this particular debate, I think that the affirmative team actually has a few interesting questions that they should be asking in terms of modeling. The first is about what specifically are you banning? Where does the end of political opinion polling start not being political? What specifically are you going to be banning? But the second thing is, are you also banning the conducting of opinion polls, even if they are not published? Obviously, the negative team cannot outlaw the forming of political opinion polls. You cannot report on a poll that has not been collected. But would you also try and stop parties from conducting opinion polls in the first place? I would probably, in this particular debate, err on the side of saying that lots of the harms that you are looking for are going to be in the publication rather than the opinion polls themselves. But if you think differently and you think that actually lots of your harms are about opinion polls existing, not just people knowing that they exist, then it might even be worth banning the conducting of opinion polls. As the negative team, you have a couple of things that you can also choose, which are, how do you want to regulate opinion polls? As always in a ban debate, the negative team can regulate and therefore limit the scope of the thing that the affirmative team needs to ban. Again, as always, there is a risk associated with this. Every time that a negative team tries to lesser how much do the thing that the affirmative team is banning, they do somewhat admit that there is something a bit wrong with it that they are trying to restrict. But there might be good reasons to regulate what types of questions can be asked on opinion polls if you think that they are particularly problematic, or who can conduct political polls if you think that only certain groups should be able to. The next thing to do after you've thought of all of your setup behind the debate is to start to brainstorm your point ideas. I would recommend trying to think of a few arguments for each side of the debate, regardless of which side of the topic you are on, so that you have some idea of what the other team might argue for in this debate as well. There are a few things that I think you should think about in terms of trying to create a series of different points. Think about how different groups are likely to interact with political opinion polls. Does the average voter react differently to a political opinion poll than a politician would to the publication of a political opinion poll? If you are affirmative, think about why both of those reactions might be bad and why it's important that you restrict both of them. If you are negative, think about why those reactions might both be good and why we shouldn't restrict either of them. You can also think about different types of political opinion polls, as we mentioned beforehand. If you can think of lots of different types of political opinion polls, you can then also often think of different types of arguments that you can run in the debate and different subpoints to the same argument. I would also recommend thinking about the different stages of an opinion poll in order to come up with different points relating to each stage of it. What are the harms and benefits that exist of banning the political opinion poll being conducted in the first place? Think about the people that work on a political opinion poll. What would they do if they couldn't do that? Think about what newspapers might report on if they could not report on a political opinion poll. What would they report on instead? Would that be better? Would that be worse? Think about how a person that reads a newspaper would react to reading each of those things. And then think about how a person might change their vote if they read a political opinion poll. Or would they not change their vote at all? These are all the kinds of questions that there are lots of different answers to. You can think of probably lots of different reasons for those lots of different answers. So that's why I recommend asking yourself all of those questions. At this stage in the QDU Academy sessions, we tend to get people to share their ideas. Obviously, this is a video, so you cannot share your ideas with me. But if you are watching this video as a team, I recommend now probably pausing the video actually and going back to the previous slide and trying to brainstorm independently and then share your ideas in a group. If you're watching this by yourself, it's also probably worth pausing the video and asking yourself some of the questions that I just asked and take a moment to see if you can come up with some arguments. You won't have an opportunity to share them with anyone just yet, but hopefully you can at your team's next training session. The next thing to do is, once you have come up with your points, to begin structuring your argument. This is something that you may have encountered quite a bit before. If it's very familiar to you, you probably don't need to continue watching to the end of this video, as it's largely a recap of a series of debating skills. But if you would like to either get a recap or learn for the first time a few tips about structuring your arguments and responding to arguments, I recommend continuing. So a good way to structure your argument is to ask yourself a series of questions in order to make it as persuasive as possible for the adjudicator. You want to broadly have something that is a point. A point be a sentence which, if true, is a reason that the adjudicator might say that you won the debate at the end of the debate. So, for example, if you're the affirmative team, we should ban the public political opinion polls because they mislead the public. That is a sentence which, if true, an adjudicator might think, yes, you should win the debate. As the negative, you might say, we should not ban the publication of political opinion polls because they give vital information to voters to inform their vote. Again, that feels true. That feels like, if it is true, an adjudicator could say that's a good reason to not support the topic. But then, obviously, just having a point is not sufficient. You should then try and prove a few things. Firstly, why is this true? Give an explanation of the logical steps that create this being true. Also, look at evidence and examples that are able to support this particular idea of it being true. The second thing to do is to ask, why is this particularly important? Something just being true does not necessarily compel us to action. Lots of things we are aware are true, but they do not change our behavior. You want to convince an adjudicator that their mind should change and that they should be compelled to support or oppose the banning of the publication of political opinion polls. So tell us why it is so important that, again, let's say you're affirmative, that political opinion polls mislead the public. Does it mean that people vote in a different way and that different way is bad and they get bad outcomes? Does it mean, if you're negative and you're saying that they actually give vital information, that we cannot vote properly unless we know information from the publication of the polls that are going to be banned by affirmative? And that's why it's so important, and it's fundamental to our democracy, in fact, that we keep the publication legalized. Those are the kinds of questions that you should ask in order to prove that your point is going to be very true and that it is very important to an adjudicator. And then you link it very much back to the topic at the end. So that is why we should or we should not ban the publication of political opinion polls. On the flip side, you also want to think about responding to the argument. There are broadly a few things that you should think of when trying to respond to arguments. Firstly, remember that if a good argument is going to be true and important, a bad argument is going to be untrue and unimportant. Persuade the adjudicator that the reason why the other team says their argument is true is not the case, and that the reason why the other team says that you should care about their argument is also not true. If you're affirmative and the negative team has just said that they give us vital information, tell the adjudicator why they give bad information, and that even if they gave good information, it actually isn't that important because people don't vote because of opinion polls, they vote for other reasons. Maybe if you're so that's the kind of thing that you want to think of in order to prove that the other team's point is both untrue and it is unimportant. Also make sure that you listen to more than just the point label of the other team. They will give reasons behind their argument, and the reasons are more persuasive to an adjudicator than the point label themselves. An adjudicator typically won't listen to an argument where the opponent says, we should not ban political opinion polls because it would be bad for democracy, and immediately agree. They will only begin to agree once they listen to the reasons behind it. So likewise, you want to make sure that you disprove the reasons rather than just the point label. Again, at the end of these sessions, we usually then ask for people to offer some questions, if they have any, about the topic or about debating in general. If you would like the opportunity to ask one of our wonderful presenters questions, make sure to tune into QDU Academy Tuesdays a couple of weeks before the long prep debates. If you have questions and you're unable to make those sessions, make sure that you reach out to the QDU or to your school debating coordinator so that they can ask the QDU. At the end, we'd like to just remind everyone about the resources we have. Obviously, you've probably found the YouTube channel if you're watching this video, but It's also worth noting we have lots of other videos that aren't just QDU Academy on the QDU YouTube channel. If you have questions about different types of debates, for example, or different topics that occurred in other years or for other year levels, it's also worth checking out QDU Academy. You can learn a lot from it. Thank you very much for watching and listening. We hope that you do well in your next debate.